All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you just look out your window, whether you spot a tiny little insect or a massive mammal, there is an invisible biological engine driving absolutely everything you see. Today, we're going to break down exactly how that engine actually works, looking straight at the data and the raw science behind genetic adaptation. So, to really understand this great game of life, we have to kick things off with one fundamental question. How does nature actually decide who survives? Because out in the wild, survival is definitely not random. There are these invisible rules that effectively pick the winners and the losers. And honestly, once you understand these rules, it completely changes the way you look at the natural world. Here's our blueprint for today. We'll start off by uncovering the engine of evolution, then look at some wild tactics for survival, learn how to read the fossil record, and finally wrap up with how we're actually hacking biological inheritance. Okay, let's jump straight into section 1, the engine of evolution. You can think of natural selection as the literal engine of evolution, and it's basically driven by a 3-step process. It all starts with step 1, variation. Even within the same species, individuals just naturally have differences, right? Maybe it's a slightly longer beak or slightly different shell color. Then we hit step 2, overproduction. Simply put, nature produces way more offspring than a given environment can actually handle. And that inevitably brings us to step 3, competition. Because things like food and space are strictly limited, these individuals literally have to fight to survive. So, the ones who just so happen to have the most helpful variations, they win the competition, they survive, and they pass those winning traits on to the next generation. Now, here is the absolutely crucial takeaway. A population with greater genetic variation has a massively higher probability of surviving when their habitat goes through stressful changes. It's kind of like having a really diverse financial portfolio, but for survival strategies. Say a rapid climate shift hits, like, I don't know, a sudden ice age. Well, a population that already has a few individuals naturally adapted to cooler conditions is way more likely to survive and evolve. On the flip side, a group with very little variation, they might just lack the traits needed to weather the storm, and that's a fast track to extinction. Let's look at how this actually plays out in the wild. Imagine a forest where suddenly only really deep, long flowers start blooming. Hummingbirds that just happen to carry the genetics for longer beaks, they essentially hit the biological jackpot. They win the competition for food right then and there, they survive, and bam, that long beak trait spreads through the population. And we see the exact same thing across the board. Think about tall giraffes reaching leaves in areas packed with tall trees, or sea turtle hatchlings born with traits that just naturally make them a bit faster or stealthier around predators. Basically, the environment sets the test, and genetic variation provides the answers. Moving right along to section 2, tactics for survival. When we talk about camouflage, we actually see 2 totally opposite genetic strategies out there. First up is cryptic coloration. This is literally the art of vanishing completely. Picture a green tree frog just melting into wetland reeds, or a gray frog completely disappearing against some tree bark. But then, on the complete flip side, you have defensive coloration. Instead of trying to hide, these organisms use crazy bright, super conspicuous colors to basically shout at predators, "Hey, I'm toxic, do not eat me." You see this all the time with things like the neon blue poison dart frog. Now, you might intuitively think that being a plain, boring color helps you slip by unnoticed, right? Well, the data tells a completely different story. It turns out that caterpillars rocking highly conspicuous black and yellow stripes actually have drastically higher survival rates compared to the purely yellow or purely black ones. It's wild. Nature genuinely rewards the bold warning label. It really just proves that sometimes standing out and signaling danger is a way better survival tactic than just trying to blend in. All right, that brings us to section 3, reading the fossil record. So, one of the biggest tools scientists use to track these evolutionary changes over millions of years is something called comparative anatomy. And the core idea here is straightforward, but honestly so profound. Organisms with similar bone structures, what we call homologous structures, share a common ancestor. When biologists analyze these shared skeletal blueprints across wildly diverse animals, and by the way, it is just crazy to think about comparing the wings of pterodactyls, bats, and modern birds, they can essentially reconstruct the entire evolutionary family tree. It's hands down one of the most remarkable ways to prove that a modern-day animal evolved directly from an ancestor we find in the fossil record. But that begs the question, how do we actually figure out the timeline for all these ancestors? Well, to track the chronology, scientists use a sort of geologic clock anchored by the law of superposition. It sounds complex, but this principle simply determines the relative age of fossils by looking at exactly where they sit inside undisturbed layers of sedimentary rock. It's a surprisingly elegant concept. We're basically reading the Earth itself like one giant million-page history book. When you map out these undisturbed rock layers, the timeline practically jumps right out at you. The layers buried at the very bottom are obviously the oldest. That means any fossils you find way down there, like those freaky little ancient trilobites, are the oldest in the bunch. Then, as you move up closer to the surface, the rock layers and the fossils trapped inside them get progressively younger. And sure enough, that top layer is exactly where you start finding much more recent mammalian fossils. Okay, but here's what's truly mind-blowing about all of this. We can actually use these fossils to figure out massive historical shifts in the environment itself. Just picture a paleontologist digging out in some bone-dry, scorching desert, right? And suddenly they pull up the fossilized remains of an ancient marine fish or a trilobite. That one single discovery is absolute, undeniable proof that this dry-as-dust desert used to be completely submerged at the bottom of an ocean. So the fossil record isn't just telling us the story of how animals changed, it's literally showing us how the planet itself has radically shape-shifted over millions of years. Which leads us perfectly into our final segment, Section 4, Hacking Biological Inheritance. Today, we are actively hacking biological inheritance, and we're mostly doing it through two completely distinct technologies. First up is selective breeding. You've probably heard it called artificial selection. This is where humans step in and intentionally choose which individuals with the best traits get to breed. And then there's the much newer approach, genetic modification. This is where scientists go right into the code, directly plucking a highly specific gene from one organism and pasting it straight into the DNA of a totally different one. So let's break down selective breeding first. With artificial selection, we humans are basically replacing nature as the ultimate environmental pressure. Instead of predators or crazy weather deciding who survives, human choice is what's driving the variation. Now, this happens pretty slowly, usually over several generations. Think about a dairy farmer who decides to only breed the cows that produce the absolute most milk. Generation after generation, that farmer dramatically boosts the milk production of the entire herd. We are artificially forcing that specific trait to become dominant. Genetic modification, on the other hand, lets us completely bypass that slow, traditional breeding process. We're talking about copy-pasting traits straight across species boundaries. I mean, scientists have literally taken an antifreeze gene out of a cold water fish and popped it right into a plant. The result? A newly minted cold-resistant crop that can thrive in freezing environments where it absolutely would have died before. We are quite literally rewriting survival tactics overnight. We're creating entire fields of crops that just shrug off insect damage, and we're doing it without waiting around for millions of years of natural adaptation. But here's the really big takeaway tying all this together. Even though their approaches and timelines are totally different, both of these human interventions share the exact same core capability. They both drastically change how biological traits are expressed and inherited. So, whether we're doing it the slow way, over generations out in a pasture, or the fast way, instantly inside a high-tech lab, we are fundamentally pulling the exact same genetic levers that nature has been pulling for millions of years. Which really leaves us with this final, highly provocative thought to chew on as we wrap up today's explainer. We've just seen exactly how the engine of life operates, from raw variation and intense competition, right up to targeted genetic modification. But if we humans now possess the technological power to completely bypass natural selection and rewrite the rules of biological inheritance ourselves, what exactly will the future of evolution even look like? It's a massive, incredible question, and honestly, it's one we are all going to be watching unfold in real time.